Okay, so just bear in mind there may be a wee bit of background noise here because it's a snow day and all five kids are off. But so basically the laws of Purim. So Purim is a holiday by rabbinic mandate, and yet in some senses it's actually more stringent than biblical mitzvah. It actually, Purim, the reading of the Megillah, takes precedence over Torah learning, which is actually the highest biblical mitzvah you can fulfill, and yet you have to pause your Torah learning to go and hear the Megillah. We'll start with the fast of Esther. The fast of Esther is connected to Purim. It's the day before Purim, right? And our days start at night. There was evening and there was morning, says the verse, one day. So our days start in the evening. That's why when Shabbat comes in and all the holidays come in the evening. And so, but nevertheless, so the day before Purim would be Wednesday night next week. But the fast of Esther doesn't start actually until dawn of Thursday. Starts at 5:15 a.m. approximately, and it finishes at nightfall, which is about 6:15 p.m. approximately. And usually what happens when it finishes is the Megillah, you go straight into the Megillah, it's read immediately. So this fast is not one of the ones that's mandated by the prophets, and therefore there's four of those, and therefore this one is not one of those, and it's more lenient in terms of who's exempt. So if a person's got flu, corona, let's say a bad migraine even, or a person's given birth in the last 30 days or is currently nursing, so then they would be exempt. If you're just getting a little weak in the last few hours of the fast, that doesn't count. That's just part and parcel of the fast. So tzedakah, charity, is usually customary to give on all fast days, but there's a special type of charity that's marked on this day, the fast of Esther, which is known as the half shekel, because during temple times at the beginning of the month of Adar, which we're currently in, a half shekel, which is not the same in value as a half shekel in Israel today, but a half shekel was collected from every Jewish person who's 20 years and up for the purposes of the next year's communal offerings that would take place in the temple. And so they were gathered, or they were asked for, in the beginning of the month of Adar, even though the fast of Esther is not that, but we sort of bundle it into that. And therefore we give charity on that day. Now, it's important to know the charity that is given on that day is independent of the charity given on Purim. It will not count towards the charity that one has to give on Purim, which we'll get to shortly. So the half shekel is customary to give 3 coins, because the Torah portion that discusses the idea of these half shekel donation, the half shekel donation for the temple offerings, mentions the word donation 3 times. And since the half shekel is the amount that we're giving, so we actually give we give basically, the half shekel is equivalent to, not necessarily in value, but the idea of what it commemorates. So you take 3, because it says 3 times the nation, $3.50, because it's basically one half of the local currency that you live in. So in the US it would be dollars, so it would be $3.50. Now you can't really come by $half too much anymore. So basically you can give $1.50, you don't have to, you can give more, whatever it is if you want. But basically there's usually a money basket in the synagogue or whatever that's set aside for that. If you can't get there, whatever, just give $1.50 to some Jewish charity. It should be done sometime on Thursday day between dawn and nightfall. So on Purim itself, work is not forbidden, but it is discouraged. And if it's the kind of work that doesn't take up too much of your focus, and you can still focus on the day of Purim, so then that is permitted. Obviously, if you're going to experience a loss, then you're absolutely permitted to work, and you should work, in terms of a real loss, not opportunity loss. If your boss is expecting you to go into work, you got to go into work, that's what you got to do. But if you've got the wherewithal to decide, it's best to avoid work if you can. So since Purim is a time-bound mitzvah, right? It's only once a year, and the mitzvahs that are associated with the day are all positive mitzvahs. The general rule is that time-bound positive mitzvahs, women are exempt from that classification of mitzvah in general. However, in the case of Purim, like the case of Hanukkah, women are actually obligated. The reason is because the essence of Purim is all about publicizing the miracles that took place during that time. And since women were also benefactors of those miracles, so women are also included in the obligations of the day. So the Megillah comes to the Megillah is read twice, once at night, once during the day. Nighttime means nightfall until dawn, and the daytime is sunrise until sundown. Now, if you're in a situation where you have to go to work, or you could read it from dawn already, which is a bit earlier than sunrise, but ideally it should be sunrise to sundown. On the other side of the scale, if you're coming back from work, and you still haven't heard the Megillah during the day, you could even hear it till after sundown, all the way until nightfall. Now, if you miss the nighttime reading, it doesn't help to hear the daytime reading twice. I mean, you can hear the daytime reading twice if you want, but it's not going to count for the nighttime reading. It's two separate parts. One is nighttime, one is daytime. You have to hear the Megillah live. Now, if you've got corona or you cannot get to a synagogue, not that you have the option, but you do not have an option of getting to a synagogue, or you have corona, or you're scared of that, whatever you're worried for it, you could hear it very, very. It's really in a real pressing time. You could hear it over Zoom or live stream or live over the telephone. But again, that's not preferable at all. But if you have to and you're in that situation, it would work. Since Megillah is about publicizing the miracle that took place, or the miracles that took place around that time, so ideally it should be heard as part of a public reading, which means more than 10 people. The larger the better. However, since the laws of the Megillah are that you really need to hear every word, you have to weigh up going to a bigger, a greater attended Megillah reading against the fact that you are actually going to hear the words of the reader. So again, if there's lots of noise, you also have to think about corona as well. If they're not going to observe social distancing and masks and whatever, if you're worried about that, obviously you should be, then maybe go to a smaller one. You could hear it just individually. You don't have to hear it with 10 people, but it's better. But it's not an obligation. So the mitzvah, by the way, is not to hear the Megillah. We all talk about where you're hearing the Megillah, going to hear the Megillah. It's not to hear it, it's actually to read it, right? But let's say you don't know how to read Hebrew, or even if you do, the words in the Megillah are really quite hard. They're not so common. So the mechanism that's used in the Megillah, in order for the one who's listening to actually fulfill it as if they're reading it, is something called Shomea Ka'ina, which means the one who listens is like the one who says it. And actually we use this in many mitzvahs. For example, Kiddush. So when the man of the household, for example, saying Kiddush and everyone's listening, they're fulfilling their mitzvah as if they are saying it, because when he says it, having in mind to fulfill their mitzvah for them, and they are listening with the idea in mind that they want to be fulfilled, their mitzvah, they want their mitzvah to be fulfilled, then by listening to the words, they're connecting in a way that it's as if they're saying it. That's how it kind of works. Now, granted that the Megillah has very specific laws where it has to be written on a specific parchment with specific ink in a specific way. And therefore, what you find is at the back of a chumash or a pamphlet or a booklet where you can follow along with the Megillah, that's not considered a kosher Megillah. So don't read that out loud. Even if you can read Hebrew, it won't help. And therefore, you have to listen to the person who's actually saying it from a kosher scroll. So ideally, I mean, you have to hear every word of the Megillah. It doesn't have to be every word from the kosher scroll. As long as you're hearing a majority of the Megillah, right, specifically a majority, 51% of the Megillah from a kosher scroll, you can make up the words in Hebrew, right? It has to be in order though. So for example, if there's a lot of noise when the reader is reading the Megillah and you miss a few words completely, you have to read it in order, which means that you can't just all of a sudden insert the words you missed and then just carry on listening to the reader, because that's as if you're saying it out of order. You're basically listening to the reader saying all the words, and by the time that you miss that word and you're going to make it up, he's already gone ahead another few verses. So it's as if you're hearing those few verses and you're just inserting the words there. And that's not going to help. You have to say it in order. So basically you have to be pretty proficient in Hebrew and be able to say the words quickly if you miss it. Now, so what happens though if you space out, right? Which happens. Basically, is that considered not listening? So the best analogy I would say is like if you pick something in a room where you are right now, like which has got a few items, and you focus on one of those items, right? So all the other items that are behind it or around the room or whatever, you peripherally pick them up. You're not focused on them, but you're peripherally picking them up, right? Now, if you choose to now focus on one of those items instead of what you were before, so the thing that you were focusing before also becomes just kind of in the background, but peripherally you see it, but it's not the thing you're focused on. That's okay when it comes to listening to the Megillah. In other words, if your mind starts to wander, and again, there's a lot of interesting costumes, it's an upbeat vibe, it's like we're ADD anyway, and so your mind wanders, So that's okay as long as you're hearing the words. You don't actually have to super focus on them, to that extent. However, if all of a sudden you take your phone out and you get a message, an interesting message, you start to read an email, so all your focus is basically on that email now. And what happens is the words of the speaker who you were listening to before, the words of the reader of the Megillah, now just become like a cacophony of sound. It's just like this white noise, and that's not good enough. So you have to try and stay minimally focused to the degree that I just said. Again, if you miss words completely, you have to make them up, but you have to make them up all the way through to where the point where the reader is currently, and then you can stop and listen to the reader. Now, there's parts of the Megillah that the congregation says out loud, right? They say it out loud for the purpose of making sure that anyone who's sort of spacing out gets back into it. There's specific parts. There's about 4 of them, and they range from, it takes about 10 to 30 seconds to say. And what happens is the reader will pause at that moment, and everyone will say them. And then the reader will wait until everyone's stopped, and then he'll start again. Sometimes he doesn't wait that long, and you can be in the middle of saying those things. Now, as I said, most people are saying those things from a booklet, a pamphlet, or something which is not a kosher Megillah, and that wouldn't help to say those things, right, necessarily. If it's less than half, then it would count. But basically what I advise you to do is, if you're not a good Hebrew reader, or you're not familiar with those words, and all of a sudden you try to start saying them, and then before you know it, the reader of the Megillah has started reading again, just stop where you are. It's not that important. It's more important to hear the words that he says. So if you're in that situation where it's one of those places where the whole crowd starts to say those verses, and you're saying it with them, and then the reader starts again, just stop where you are, because you have to really hear it from the reader, not from your little booklet or pamphlet, or it has to be a kosher Megillah scroll that you're hearing it from. So that's basically the Megillah, and the same rules apply both during the nighttime and the daytime. Now, dressing up, there's a lot of fancy dress there. The Torah law is that women can't dress up as men, and vice versa. There's a spectrum to exactly how far-reaching that is. But at Purim, we can rely on a leniency if that kind of floats your boat. You could wear one item of garb that is primarily designated to be of the opposite genders, provided that your real identity, your real gender is still obviously apparent, right? So, you can use your imagination basically, but just, if for me to wear a wig, whatever, or a head covering or something to look like a woman, that would be okay. But once I put on my makeup and everything else, then I look more like Jenny than Jonny. So, which, this depends who you're talking to. I think I'm quite a good-looking woman, actually, when it comes to it. In any case, so that's the gifts to the. Now that's that. Gifts to the poor. This is the second mitzvah of Purim. So the first is the Megillah, which is the nighttime and the daytime, and then there's the gifts to the poor. So this is basically everyone should minimally give 2 gifts to 2 people, 1 to each person. What gifts? It can be through money, food or drink, or clothing. It's customary to give money. Now we'll see, this is nothing to do with the other mitzvah of sending food to people, food items, and that people give gifts and presents, and you see, people delivering. That's a separate mitzvah we'll get to soon. This is gifts to the poor, not to friends or to people that you're not so close with, but you want to, bring a bit of unity between you. This is to the poor. So it's customary really to give money, but you could do it through food or drink or clothing. Now, what's interesting about this is that because it's its own separate mitzvah, you cannot use the money that you give as part of your yearly charity, which is basically called Meiser. And the way that works is that any money you earn after tax, you give 10% of that to charity, right? That's a separate mitzvah. You cannot use that money to fulfill this mitzvah of giving money to the poor, right? However, if you want to go above and beyond the basic requirement of how much money is necessary, and I'll get to that in a minute, and you want to give more, then you can deduct that extra amount from what you would have given from that 10%, that Meiser, which is basically the 10% after tax of your earnings, yearly earnings, monthly earnings, whatever it is. So what is the basic amount required? It's the amount that basically the poor person could go and get a decent meal. Like, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, but I would say about $15. So you have to do that to 2 people. It has to be distributed on the day of Purim itself. Now, what you find is you might not find a poor person appropriate on the day of Purim to give it to. So what should you do? So there's many organizations online as well that accept donations on credit card, whatever, before Purim, even now, and they make sure that they distribute the funds on Purim. So you don't have to be worried about that. Now, what level of poverty are we talking about? It doesn't mean that they're begging on the street with, torn clothing. Anyone who's struggling financially to make ends meet on a basic level. Okay, now is the next mitzvah, which is the sending of the gifts, which is the one that you see people stopping in cars and beeping and honking and getting out and giving gifts to people, and they're, ringing people's doorbells and whatever. So that is sending. Before we said it's sending 2 gifts, it's 1 to each person. That's with the money to the poor. This is sending 2 gifts to 2 people. That's 2 to each person. And here, unlike the one with the money, this one is only done through food or drink, right? The other one you could do through food or drink or clothing or money. This is only done through food or drink, not money. Ideally, it should actually be done through someone else, that you should be giving this gift through someone else, because the word that is used for this mitzvah is the word that means an agent, to give it through someone else. But it's not mandatory. You can give it to the person, without doing that. The recipient, though, who you're giving it to, has to know it was you that sent the gift. So if you're sending it through a child or someone else, or you're just dropping it off at someone's door and their kid answers or whatever, they have to know that when the kid has to know, whoever's giving it to them, that whoever they're supposed to give it to, the one that you want to give your gift to, that person has to know that it's come from you. The best thing to really do is to put a card or a note on it and explain, because sometimes people are not even in, and you ring the doorbell and you just leave it on the doorstep. So just write a note that it's from you. Now, you can also fulfill the mitzvah by re-giving the gifts that were given to you, because once they were given to you, you now own them. So if you want to repackage them, if you wanted to, you could do that. Just remember to take the card off and the note. So yeah, the gifts really have to be delivered on Purim Day. They have to be delivered on Purim Day to fulfill the mitzvah. So therefore, if you're going to send through Amazon, UPS, just be careful, make sure that they actually get there on the day. So the idea of the mitzvah is to increase friendship and unity. So despite the fact that we're used to sending gifts to our close friends and everything, it's actually better to send it to somebody who you're not close with, or even enemies. Better. Not that you should have any, but so what type of foods or drinks can you give? So it has to be 2 different types to each person. So 2 different foods, or 2 different drinks, or 1 of each. You can give 2 cans of. You could really give 2 cans of Coke if you wanted, or a burger, for example, like a ready-made. You should give, if you're giving food, it shouldn't be something which basically needs to get cooked. Like, you have to start preparing it and doing more cooking to it. You can do it, but it's not the best way to do the mitzvah, to give someone like a raw piece of steak where they have to sort of get busy and start cooking it, or mincemeat, I don't know, whatever. So basically, if you'd give something that's ready-made, it's better. Now, 2 foods. So if you give a burger, let's say, that wouldn't count as 2 foods, even though there's bread and meat. It's really just one thing. So you have to give. There's no minimum amount that you have to give, right? But it should be something which is appropriate according to the recipient standards. If you're going to give somebody who's usually used to a wealthy, person that's used to fine dining, to give them a little juice box and a stale rugelach, it's not probably going to cut the mustard, really. Then there's the Purim Meal. The Purim Meal has to, again, also only be fulfilled during the day of Purim, not the night. Not to say that you shouldn't have a nice dinner in honor of Purim, but that's not fulfilling the mitzvah of the festive meal of Purim. Now, usually because people are busy with the Megillah reading and delivering the gifts and sending the money to the poor, so the Purim Meal tends to start a bit later in the afternoon, usually in Purim. However, this year, Purim Day is on Friday, so the Shabbat to worry about. You got to get ready for Shabbat. You can't do work on Shabbat. You should also come into Shabbat with an appetite, and preferably not plastered. So this means that the mitzvahs of Purim have to be done in a much more focused and punctual way to make sure that Shabbos is not compromised. And this year on Friday, Shabbos comes in around 5:45, so that should be done. Everything should be done with that in mind. Now, what about getting drunk? So yes, there is a mitzvah to drink. However, You got to understand the difference between a mitzvah and an obligation. All the other things that I spoke about, all the other mitzvahs that I spoke about are obligation mitzvahs. You have to do them. This is not a obligation mitzvah. This is a mitzvah if you do it, but there's no transgression if you don't do it. It's like bonus points, right? So the reason why we drink is because the whole series of events, miraculous events surrounding Purim, all started when the Jews were told not to attend the king's massive extravaganza of a party. They didn't listen. They went, and there was a lot of wine being drunk. And also, Queen Esther used wine in order to convince, or try to convince, the villain, I guess, of the hero of the Purim story, Haman, to basically, and Achashverosh, rather, the king, to basically condemn his viceroy Haman rather than to condemn the Jews. And basically, so we drink wine specifically, right? The idea of that is to remember it through wine. And the language the sages use about this mitzvah of doing that is that it says one should get to a point where one cannot tell the difference between blessed Mordechai. Mordechai is the hero of the Purim story. You shouldn't know the difference between blessed Mordechai and cursed Haman, and the villain of the Purim story. You shouldn't know the difference between the two. There's major deep Torah ideas written in this, but the basic idea is that both good and bad come from Hashem, and He works in mysterious ways, the vast majority of which is beyond human comprehension. And what our perception of bad is, ultimately, is good coming from a good source. Now, the major dispute among the authorities how to fulfill that idea of that statement. Some say get absolutely plastered. Others say no, drink a little more than you would normally, and then have a little nap, because you're drinking a bit of wine, or you're remembering the wine part, and you're also getting to the point where you don't know the difference. One sec. Okay. You're also sorry about that. You're also getting to the point where you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai because you're sleeping. Now, everybody agrees, though, that somebody whom alcohol doesn't agree with particularly well, right? Those fairies out there, unlike the hardened Scots. So if they get too aggressive when they're drunk or whatever, don't drink. Rather, just go to sleep. It's not helpful to do that. Basically, you shouldn't get to a point of embarrassing, but have a good time, enjoy yourself, and that's basically it. Make sure you get ready for Shabbos and have a good day. And that's basically it.